It was a crisp autumn evening, the kind where the sun hung low, casting golden light over the rows of identical houses in our quiet suburban neighborhood. I drove home from the charity event, still dressed in a formal blouse and pencil skirt, but the smile I had worn for the donors and board members had long faded. The weight of the evening hung over me, not the work or the endless small talk, but the emptiness that followed. As always, Tom hadn't come. Business trip, he'd said, though I doubted that now more than ever. Tom's absences had become a steady rhythm of our marriage, one I danced to without even noticing anymore. I reached for the radio knob to fill the silence in the car, but a movement on the sidewalk caught my attention. At the corner near the coffee shop, a man sat with his back to the brick wall, legs crossed, and a weathered jacket pulled tight against the cooling air. He had a sign propped up next to him, but I couldn't make out the words from where I parked at the red light. His face was turned down, but the halo of the setting sun caught the gray strands threading through his dark hair. It was the smallest thing, a moment of eye contact, fleeting and unintentional. His eyes were a piercing, almost startling shade of blue, and in that brief glance, there was no plea for pity. There was no accusation, just quiet resignation. Something inside me shifted. The light turned green, but I didn't press the gas. Cars honked behind me, but I ignored them, pulling into the coffee shop parking lot instead. I wasn't sure what I was doing as I stepped out of the car, clutching the jacket that matched my charity-appropriate outfit. "Excuse me," I called out, approaching him cautiously. He looked up, startled but not unkind. Up close, he was older than I had thought, maybe 50, maybe older. His skin was weathered, and his beard had streaks of silver. He had the kind of face you'd see on an old portrait, rugged and full of stories that never got told. "Ma'am," he greeted with a nod, his voice low and gravelly. There was a quiet strength in the way he held himself, even as he sat on the cold pavement. "Are you hungry?" I asked, awkwardly, clutching the handles of my purse. He hesitated as though gauging my intent. "A meal wouldn't hurt," he said finally. I nodded, my mind racing. "Wait here." I hurried inside the coffee shop and ordered a sandwich and soup, ignoring the curious glances from the barista as I specified extra napkins and utensils. When I returned, he accepted the bag with a quiet "thank you," but nothing else. I hovered, unsure what to do. "Do you live around here?" I asked, cringing at the ridiculousness of the question. He gave me a half smile. "Not anymore." There was no bitterness in his tone, no shame, just a simple truth that hung in the air. I sat down on the bench a few feet away from him, trying to mask my discomfort. "I'm Lisa," I offered after a moment. Silence fell between us, broken only by the hum of passing cars. I found myself studying him, noticing things I hadn't before, the way his hands trembled slightly as he opened the sandwich wrapper, the careful way he ate, as though rationing each bite. It wasn't pity I felt. At least I didn't think it was. It was curiosity, an inexplicable pull toward someone whose life was so different from mine. "What's your story?" I asked suddenly, surprising myself. Jack paused mid-bite, his eyes narrowing slightly as he regarded me. "What makes you think it's a story worth telling?" I flushed, stammering an apology, but he shook his head. "Relax," he said with a small chuckle. "I'm just not used to people asking." I waited, unsure if he would say more. He didn't, at least not then. Instead, he finished his meal in silence, thanked me again, and stood to leave. "Wait," I blurted out, standing too quickly. "Do you have anywhere to go?" Jack turned back to me, his expression unreadable. "I'll manage." The words stung more than I expected. They were the kind of words I'd heard Tom say countless times when I tried to ask if he needed anything, wanted anything, if he was happy. "I'll manage," he'd always reply, shutting the door on conversations before they could begin. "Would you?" The words caught in my throat. "Would you like a place to sleep tonight? I have a garage. It's warm." And Jack raised an eyebrow, his expression cautious. "You don't even know me." "I know," I admitted, my cheeks burning. "But it's just one night. If you want." He stared at me for a long moment, his piercing gaze seeming to strip away every layer of pretense I'd ever built. Finally, he nodded. "All right." The drive home was quiet. Jack sat stiffly in the passenger seat, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. I kept stealing glances at him, trying to piece together the fragments of a life I couldn't see. He was quiet, but not withdrawn, his gaze flicking to the houses we passed, as though cataloging each detail. When we arrived, I led him to the garage, hastily clearing space among the boxes and garden tools. I felt ridiculous as I set up an old cot and offered him blankets, but Jack accepted everything with quiet grace. "Thank you," he said again as he settled onto the cot. His voice was steady, but I could see the exhaustion in his eyes. "It's no trouble," I replied, though the truth was I didn't know why I was doing this. As I closed the garage door, I lingered for a moment, listening to the stillness inside. That night, as I lay in bed, Tom's side empty as always, I couldn't stop thinking about Jack. Not just his circumstances, but the way he carried himself, like a man who had once had everything and lost it. Like a man who had stories he didn't want to tell, not because they were boring, but because they mattered too much. I didn't know then what I'd set in motion, but for the first time in a long time I felt something, a spark of curiosity, of purpose, or maybe something deeper I wasn't ready to name. The morning light seeped into the kitchen as I brewed my coffee, its rich aroma filling the room. I was already dressed for the day, though I had nowhere to be. It was a habit I'd developed over the years. Routine was my anchor. Yet as I stared out the window at the garage where Jack had slept, my thoughts were anything but routine. Had he left? Would he simply vanish as abruptly as he'd entered my life? I opened the back door hesitantly, stepping into the crisp air. The garage door was still closed. My hand lingered on the handle for a moment before I lifted it. Inside, Jack was awake, sitting on the edge of the cot, staring at his hands. The cot looked small under his tall frame, his shoulders hunched as though the space confined him. "Good morning," I ventured, feeling awkward again. Jack looked up, his expression neutral but not unkind. "Morning. I made some coffee. Would you like some?" He nodded, standing slowly. "That'd be nice." We moved inside, the silence stretching between us like a bridge too fragile to cross. Jack stood near the kitchen island, his posture tentative, as though afraid to take up space. I poured him a mug and handed it over. His hands wrapped around it, the steam curling into the air between us. "You don't have to keep standing," I said, gesturing to the small kitchen table. He hesitated before sitting, his movements deliberate and careful. As he took his first sip, a small sigh escaped him, and I felt a surprising flicker of satisfaction. "You don't have to stay," I said after a moment, surprising myself. "I mean, you're welcome to, but I don't want you to feel trapped." Jack raised an eyebrow, his lips twitching into a faint smirk. You're the first person to offer me a place to sleep, let alone coffee in the morning. Trust me, trapped isn't the word I'd use. I laughed nervously, stirring my own coffee, though I didn't need to. Uh, I guess I don't usually do things like this. Wait, did you? He asked, his tone curious but not intrusive. I didn't have an answer, not one I was ready to admit, even to myself. I don't know, I said finally. It just felt right. Jack nodded, as though that was answer enough. He drank his coffee in slow, measured sips, his gaze moving around the room. His eyes landed on the old clock above the stove, then on the framed photo of Tom and me from our wedding day. His gaze lingered there, but he didn't comment. "You're handy, aren't you?" I blurted out, desperate to fill the silence. "I noticed how you fixed that latch on the garage door last night." Jack shrugged. "I've picked up a few things over the years. You learn to make do." "Well," I said, seizing the opportunity, "if you're willing, there's a broken fence in the backyard that could use fixing. Tom's been meaning to get to it, but, well, you know how it is." Jack didn't respond to the mention of Tom, but he nodded. "Sure, happy to help." By the afternoon, the fence was repaired, its slats straight and sturdy again. Jack worked with the kind of quiet efficiency I envied, his focus unbroken as he moved. I brought him water and we exchanged a few words, but mostly I watched from the kitchen window, feeling a strange mix of admiration and guilt. When he finished, I walked outside with a plate of sandwiches. "You didn't have to do it all in one go," I said, handing him the plate. Jack wiped his hands on his jeans and took the plate with a nod of thanks. Didn't see the point in stopping halfway. I sat down on the porch step, watching as he ate. His movements were methodical, unhurried, as though each bite was part of some unspoken ritual. I wanted to ask him more about his life, but I wasn't sure how. Finally, I found the courage. "Jack, can I ask you something?" He looked at me, his blue eyes steady. "Go ahead." "How did you end up—" I hesitated, not wanting to sound condescending. "I mean, what brought you here? To this town, I mean." Jack leaned back slightly, setting the plate on the step beside him. "I've been wandering for a while," he said slowly. "Ended up here because it was as good a place as any to stop. The truth is, I don't really have a destination." The simplicity of his answer caught me off guard. "But you must have had a life before, a family, a career." Jack's gaze dropped to the ground, his fingers tracing invisible patterns on the porch. "Yeah," he said softly, "I did." I waited, sensing that there was more, but he didn't elaborate. The silence between us felt heavy but not uncomfortable. It was a silence that held understanding, even without words. "Sometimes," he said after a moment, "life just unravels, one thread at a time, until there's nothing left but the frayed edges." His words lingered in the air, raw and unfiltered. I didn't press further. I knew what it felt like to watch something fall apart, even if it wasn't the same as his experience. "Well," I said, trying to lighten the mood, "you've made a great start at putting my fence back together." Jack smiled faintly, his eyes meeting mine for a moment. "Glad I could help." Over the next few days, Jack stayed in the garage, and though we didn't talk much, his presence began to feel less strange. He helped around the house, fixing small things I hadn't even realized were broken. Each repair felt like a tiny act of care, and I found myself looking forward to the moments when we'd sit and share coffee or exchange a few words. Tom, of course, didn't notice. He called once saying he'd be delayed another week. He didn't ask about me or how I was managing. It was just business as usual. One evening, as Jack and I sat on the porch watching the sunset, I asked, "Do you ever think about starting over?" Jack didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet. "Sometimes. But starting over isn't easy when you don't know where to begin." I nodded, understanding more than I wanted to admit. "I feel that way too sometimes," I said, surprising myself with the admission. Jack turned to look at me, his expression unreadable. "Why?" The question hung in the air, and I realized I didn't have an easy answer. "Because I think I've been standing still for a long time," I said finally, "and I'm not sure how to move forward." Jack's gaze softened, and for the first time, I felt seen. Not just as Lisa, the dutiful wife and neighbor, but as something more, as someone searching. The moment passed quickly, but it stayed with me long after. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I realized that Jack wasn't just fixing things in my house. He was quietly fixing something in me. The rain began suddenly that evening, the kind of storm that arrives unannounced, drenching everything in minutes. I stood at the kitchen window, watching as the drops pelted against the glass. The rhythmic sound of water hitting the roof was oddly soothing, though it made the house feel emptier. Tom hadn't called today. Not that I was surprised. A flash of movement caught my eye. Jack was outside, gathering tools he'd left in the yard earlier. He worked quickly, his shirt clinging to his back as the rain soaked through. Without thinking, I grabbed an umbrella and rushed out. "Jack!" I called over the downpour, holding the umbrella high as I approached. "What are you doing? You'll catch a cold." Jack turned, his hair plastered to his forehead. He looked at me with mild amusement. "Just trying to save your tools," he replied, his voice raised to be heard over the rain. "Didn't think you'd want them rusting." "You're going to freeze out here," I said, motioning toward the garage. "Come inside." He hesitated for a moment, then nodded. Together, we darted toward the garage, the umbrella doing little to shield us from the rain. Once inside, I set the umbrella aside, wringing water from my sleeves. Jack stood a few feet away, dripping onto the concrete floor. "Let me grab you a towel," I said, stepping toward the door that led to the house. "No need," Jack said quickly, his voice low. "I'll dry off in a minute." I paused, unsure why his refusal stung. "You don't have to act like a stranger," I said, trying to keep my tone light. "You've been here long enough to know you're welcome." Jack gave me a small smile, but there was something guarded in his eyes. "You've done enough for me," he said. "I don't want to take advantage." The words hung in the air, heavy with a meaning I couldn't quite grasp. I stepped closer, my arms crossed against the damp chill. "You're not," I said softly. "I wouldn't have offered if I didn't mean it." Jack looked at me then, really looked at me, and the intensity of his gaze made my breath catch. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The sound of rain against the garage roof filled the space between us, a steady rhythm that seemed to match the pounding of my heart. "You should go inside," Jack said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "You'll catch a cold too." "I'm fine," I said, though my voice was unsteady. "I don't mind staying." Jack took a step closer, his expression unreadable. "Lisa," he began, then stopped as though unsure of what to say next. His hands flexed at his sides, as though he was wrestling with something unspoken. "Yes," I prompted, my own voice trembling now. He shook his head, a rueful smile tugging at his lips. "You're something else," he said, almost to himself. "Not many people would do what you've done for me." "It's nothing," I said quickly, but Jack shook his head again. "It's not nothing," he said firmly. "You've shown me kindness I didn't think I deserved." My cheeks burned and I looked away, unable to hold his gaze. "You're a good person, Jack," I said softly. "Anyone can see that." Jack's laugh was low and bitter. "Not everyone would agree." "I don't care what they think," I said, surprising even myself with the conviction in my voice. "I know what I see." When I looked up again, Jack was closer, his eyes searching mine. The air between us felt charged, as though the storm outside had seeped into the room. My heart pounded, my breath coming shallow as Jack raised a hand, hesitating for a moment before brushing a stray strand of hair from my face. It was such a small gesture, but it set something alight inside me, a spark that had been buried for years, smothered under layers of routine and obligation. I knew I should step back, break the moment before it crossed a line, but I couldn't move. "Oh, Lisa," Jack said again, his voice barely audible. "I don't want to do something we'll both regret." "We won't," I said, though I wasn't sure if I believed it. My voice trembled, betraying the mix of fear and longing that coursed through me. Jack's hand dropped back to his side, his expression conflicted. "You're married," he said, as though reminding himself. "Am I?" I shot back, surprising us both. "Tom hasn't been here in months. Even when he's home, it's like he's not." Jack flinched at my words, guilt flickering in his eyes. "That doesn't mean—" "I know," I interrupted, my voice breaking. "I know it's wrong, but I don't know how to stop feeling this way." Jack stared at me, his jaw tight. For a moment I thought he might say something else, but then he stepped back, creating space between us. The loss of his warmth felt like a physical ache. "You should go inside," he said again, his tone firm now. I opened my mouth to argue, but the look in his eyes stopped me. He was protecting me, I realized, protecting us both from a line we weren't ready to cross. Without another word, I turned and walked back to the house, the rain soaking me all over again. My hand shook as I closed the door behind me, leaning against it for support. My heart felt heavy, torn between guilt and something dangerously close to hope. The days that followed were strained, though Jack and I pretended otherwise. We fell into a routine of polite conversation and small gestures, but the unspoken tension between us lingered like a shadow. One evening, as I cleared the dinner dishes, Jack stood in the doorway of the kitchen, watching me. I turned to him, wiping my hands on a towel. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice tentative. Jack hesitated before nodding. "I've been thinking," he said slowly. "Maybe it's time I moved on." The words hit me like a blow, and I struggled to keep my expression neutral. "You don't have to," I said quickly. "You're welcome to stay as long as you need." "I know," Jack said, his voice gentle, "but I don't want to make things harder for you." "They're not," I insisted, but Jack's gaze told me he didn't believe me. "Lisa," he said softly, stepping closer, "you've already done more for me than I deserve. I won't let you ruin your life because of me." "You're not ruining anything," I said, my voice rising. "You've done more for me than you realize." Jack looked at me, his eyes filled with an emotion I couldn't name. For a moment, I thought he might argue, but then he simply nodded. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "for everything." That night, as I lay in bed, I felt the weight of his words pressing down on me. I didn't want him to leave, but I didn't know how to ask him to stay without saying things I wasn't ready to admit, even to myself. The day Jack said he would leave, the house felt emptier than usual. I tried to focus on my routine, washing the dishes, folding laundry, tidying the living room, but my hands moved mechanically. The thought of him walking out of my life left a hollow ache in my chest that I couldn't ignore. Jack spent most of the morning repairing a creaky garden gate that didn't really need fixing. I watched him from the kitchen window, feeling the words I wanted to say trapped in my throat. He worked quietly, his movements precise and unhurried, as though he was savoring every moment. When he finally came inside, wiping his hands on a rag, I couldn't hold back any longer. "Jack," I said, my voice faltering as I met him in the hallway, "you don't have to go." He stopped, looking at me with a mixture of surprise and resignation. "Oh, Lisa, we've talked about this." "No, we haven't," I said, my tone more forceful than I intended. "You've decided, but I haven't had a say." Jack sighed, leaning against the wall. "This isn't good for you," he said quietly, "or for me." I stepped closer, the distance between us feeling unbearable. "What if it is?" I said, my voice breaking. "What if it's the only thing that's felt real to me in years?" Jack's expression softened, but there was still a wariness in his eyes. "Lisa, you're married. I won't be the reason you regret anything." I shook my head, tears welling up. "Do you think I don't regret the life I've been living? Do you think I don't regret staying in a marriage that's been empty for years? You've done nothing but remind me what it feels like to be seen." Jack's jaw tightened, his hands flexing at his sides. For a long moment he didn't speak, and I feared I had pushed him too far. But then he closed the distance between us in 2 deliberate steps, his hand lifting to cup my face. "I don't want to hurt you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You won't," I whispered, leaning into his touch. "You already haven't." The space between us vanished. His lips met mine, tentative at first, as though he was testing the waters. But the moment I responded, his restraint crumbled. His kiss was deep and consuming, a mix of longing and desperation that mirrored everything I felt. When we finally broke apart, both of us breathless, he rested his forehead against mine. "This doesn't solve anything," he murmured, though his voice lacked conviction. "No," I agreed, my fingers gripping his shirt, "but it's a start." That night, the storm that had been brewing between us finally broke. It wasn't planned or calculated, it simply happened. We sat in the living room after dinner, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Jack was telling me a story about his past, his voice low and steady, but I barely heard the words. All I could focus on was the way his hands moved as he spoke, the way his eyes lit up when he described something he was passionate about. Mm, Without thinking, I reached out and placed my hand over his. He stopped mid-sentence, his gaze snapping to mine. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then, slowly, he turned his hand to entwine our fingers. "Lisa," he said softly, his tone both a question and a warning. "I know," I whispered, "but I don't care." Jack exhaled sharply, as though he'd been holding his breath for days. He pulled me closer, his hand cradling the back of my neck as he kissed me again. This time, there was no hesitation. The walls we'd built around ourselves came crashing down, leaving only raw emotion in their wake. We moved together as though we'd done this 1,000 times, yet every touch felt electric and new. It wasn't just physical. It was something deeper, something that reached the parts of me I thought had long since died. For the first time in years, I felt alive. The next morning, I woke before the sun, the faint light of dawn filtering through the curtains. Jack was still asleep beside me, his breathing slow and even. I watched him for a moment, a wave of guilt washing over me, despite the warmth that lingered from the night before. What had I done? Slipping out of bed, I wrapped a robe around myself and padded to the kitchen. The house felt unnervingly still, as though it too was grappling with what had happened. I stood at the sink, staring out at the garden, my mind racing. I loved Jack. That much was clear now, but love wasn't enough to erase the complexities of our situation. Tom might have been absent, but he was still my husband. What would happen if he found out? What would people say? The sound of footsteps pulled me from my thoughts. I turned to see Jack standing in the doorway, his hair tousled and his expression unreadable. "Morning," he said, his voice soft. "Morning," I replied, my hands twisting the hem of my robe. Jack stepped closer, his eyes searching mine. "You're overthinking," he said simply. "How do you know?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. He gave me a small smile. "'Cause you have that look, like you're carrying the weight of the world." I sighed, leaning against the counter. Maybe I am." Jack reached out, his hand brushing mine. "We don't have to figure everything out right now," he said. "Let's just take it one step at a time." His words should have been reassuring, but they only deepened my conflict. "Jack, this can't stay secret forever," I said. "Tom will come back eventually." Jack nodded, his expression serious. "And when he does, you'll have to decide what you want." "What I want?" I repeated, my voice trembling. "I don't even know what that is anymore." Jack's hand tightened round mine. "Then figure it out. I'll wait." Over the next few days, Jack's words echoed in my mind. I tried to focus on the here and now, savoring the moments we shared, but the reality of our situation loomed over us like a storm cloud. Every glance, every touch felt bittersweet, tinged with the knowledge that it couldn't last. Tom's absence stretched longer than usual, giving us a temporary reprieve, but the longer he was gone, the more reckless I became. Jack and I stopped hiding our connection, at least within the privacy of the house. We spent our evenings talking, laughing, and holding each other, pretending for a little while that the world didn't exist outside these walls. But deep down, I knew it was only a matter of time before reality intruded. And it did. One afternoon, I was in the kitchen when my phone buzzed on the counter. It was a text from Tom. "Back early. Flight lands tonight." My heart sank, the words hitting me like a physical blow. I stared at the screen, my mind racing. Jack walked in moments later, his smile fading as he saw my expression. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. "Tom," I said, holding up the phone. "He's coming back." Jack's jaw tightened, his eyes darkening. "When?" "Tonight," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Jack stepped closer, his hand resting on my arm. "You'll figure this out, Lisa," he said firmly. "I believe in you." I nodded, though I wasn't sure I believed in myself. As the hours ticked by, the weight of what I had to face grew heavier. Jack and I sat together on the couch, holding hands in silence, knowing it might be the last time. When the clock struck 8, Jack stood, his expression resolute. "I'll give you space," he said. "Jack," I began, but he silenced me with a kiss. "Whatever happens," he said softly, "I'm here if you need me." As he walked out the door, I felt my heart break all over again. The sound of Tom's car pulling into the driveway echoed like a thunderclap through the stillness of the house. I sat at the kitchen table, my fingers gripping the edge, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure he'd hear it the moment he walked through the door. Jack was gone, having quietly packed his few belongings and left hours earlier. But the space he left behind felt cavernous, a glaring absence that even the hum of the refrigerator couldn't fill. The front door opened and Tom stepped inside, his suitcase wheels scraping against the tile. He called out, "Lisa," as though unsure I'd still be here. I stood and smoothed my dress, trying to summon calm. "In the kitchen," I called back, my voice steady only through sheer willpower. Tom appeared in the doorway, his tie slightly askew, his face betraying the exhaustion of travel. His gaze swept over me, his expression neutral. "Hey," he said, setting his bag down. "How was everything while I was gone?" "Fine," I replied automatically, though my mind screamed otherwise. "The usual." He nodded, stepping closer. "Good." His lips brushed my cheek, a perfunctory, hollow gesture, and he moved past me toward the fridge. As he opened it, I noticed a flicker of hesitation in his movements, as though he sensed something was off but didn't know what. "Dinner's in the oven," I said, needing to fill the silence. "Thanks," he replied, pulling out a bottle of water. "Work's been crazy. Glad to finally be home." The word hung in the air like a challenge. This house was a place he visited, not one he lived in. I nodded but said nothing, my thoughts racing. Would he notice the subtle changes in the house? The repaired gate, the organized garage, the lingering warmth of someone else's presence. The days that followed were an exercise in restraint. Jack's absence weighed on me, but the routines of marriage pressed on like clockwork. Tom returned to his usual habits, long hours at work, evenings spent scrolling through his phone or glued to the TV. Conversations were minimal, mostly about logistics and pleasantries, yet every time he looked at me, I felt as though he could see through me, peeling back the layers to uncover what I'd hidden. I threw myself into distraction, cleaning, organizing, gardening, anything to keep my hands busy and my mind from wandering to Jack. But at night, when the house was quiet and Tom lay snoring beside me, my thoughts betrayed me. I relived every moment with Jack, every word, every touch, the way he'd made me feel alive in a way I hadn't in years. And then the questions began to creep in. Had I been selfish, reckless, or was it the first honest thing I'd done for myself in decades? One evening, about a week after Tom's return, he came home earlier than usual. I was in the backyard, trimming the roses, when he appeared behind me, startling me. "Lisa," he said, his tone cautious. "Can we talk?" My heart skipped, but I forced a smile. "Of course. What's on your mind?" He hesitated, his hands in his pockets, his gaze fixed on the ground. "You seemed different lately." "Different?" I echoed, turning back to the roses to avoid his eyes. "Here," he said, stepping closer. "I don't know. Quieter. Distracted. Is something wrong?" I straightened, gripping the shears tightly. "Nothing's wrong," I said, though the tremor in my voice betrayed me. Tom's hand touched my arm, a rare gesture of tenderness. "If something's bothering you, you can tell me." I turned to face him then, unable to hold back. Do you really mean that, Tom? Or is this just another polite conversation before you disappear into your phone? His brow furrowed, his hand dropping to his side. What are you talking about? I'm talking about us, I said, my voice rising, about how we've been living like strangers for years, pretending everything's fine when it's not. Tom looked stunned as though I'd slapped him. Lisa, where's this coming from? It's not coming from nowhere, Tom, I snapped. It's been building for years, but you've been too busy to notice. He stared at me, his mouth opening and closing as though searching for words. I didn't realize you felt this way. Of course you didn't, I said bitterly. You're never here. Tom's expression darkened, a mix of guilt and defensiveness. I've been working hard to provide for us, Lisa. I thought that's what you wanted. I wanted a husband, I said, my voice breaking. Not just a provider. I wanted someone who actually cared about me, about what I feel, about what I want. The silence that followed was deafening. Tom looked away, his jaw tight, and for a moment I thought he might leave. But then he turned back, his eyes sharp. Is there someone else? He asked, his voice low but steady. The question hit me like a punch to the gut. I opened my mouth to deny it, but the words wouldn't come. The truth hovered between us, unspoken but undeniable. Tom's face twisted, a mix of anger and hurt. There is, isn't there? I looked away, tears welling up. Tom. Who is it? He demanded, his voice rising. Who's been here while I've been gone? It's not what you think, I said, though the words felt hollow. Then what is it? He shot back. Explain it to me, Lisa, because right now I feel like an idiot. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. It wasn't planned, I said quietly. It just happened. Tom's laugh was bitter, almost a snarl. That's supposed to make me feel better? That my wife cheated on me by accident? I didn't mean to hurt you, I said, my voice breaking. Well, congratulations, he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. You did. He turned and walked away, leaving me standing there, my chest heaving with sobs I tried to suppress. The next few days were a blur of tension and avoidance. Tom barely spoke to me, and when he did, his words were clipped and cold. I stayed out of his way, retreating to the garden or the guest room to give him space. But the weight of what had been said and what hadn't hung over us like a storm cloud. One evening, as I sat on the porch staring at the darkened sky, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Jack. Are you okay? Tears blurred my vision as I typed back, no. His reply was immediate. Do you want to talk? I hesitated, my fingers hovering over the screen. Finally, I typed, I don't know what to do. Jack's response was simple. You'll figure it out. You're stronger than you think. I wanted to believe him, but the truth was, I felt anything but strong. The confrontation I'd been dreading finally came one night after dinner. Tom and I sat across from each other in the dimly lit dining room, the air between us thick with unspoken words. Lisa, he said finally, his voice tired, I need to know, are you still in love with me? The question cut through me like a blade. I looked at him, seeing for the first time the vulnerability in his eyes, the cracks in the armor he always wore. He wasn't just angry, he was hurt, betrayed. I don't know, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. Tom's jaw tightened, his hands clenching into fists on the table. Then what are we even doing? I don't know. I said again, tears streaming down my face. I've been lost for so long, Tom. I don't know who I am anymore. He stared at me, his expression hardening. Maybe it's time you figure that out. I nodded, the truth of his words sinking in. Maybe it is. That night, as I lay alone in the guest room, I stared at the ceiling, my mind spinning. I didn't know what the future held, whether my marriage could be salvaged or whether Jack and I had a chance at something real. All I knew was that I couldn't keep living the way I had, pretending everything was fine when it wasn't. It was time to make a choice. The house was silent the next morning, the kind of silence that made every creak of the floorboards and hum of the refrigerator seem deafening. Tom had left early, muttering something about a meeting, though I hadn't asked for details. I stayed in bed long after the sun rose, staring at the ceiling, the weight of the past few weeks pressing down on me like a heavy blanket. Jack hadn't texted again, and I hadn't reached out. It felt wrong, like I was walking a tightrope with no safety net. Every thought seemed to lead back to him, his steady hands repairing the fence, the warmth of his laugh, the way his eyes seemed to see right through me. And yet, the image of Tom's face, etched with betrayal and anger, haunted me just as much. Something had to give. I couldn't keep living in this limbo, torn between two lives that felt equally impossible. By mid-afternoon, I found myself in the garage, sorting through the clutter Jack had helped me organize. His absence was palpable, the space somehow emptier than it had ever been before. I ran my fingers over the old toolbox he'd used, the smooth wood of the workbench he'd fixed. It was as if his presence lingered in every corner, a ghost that refused to be ignored. As I sifted through a box of old papers, a folded piece of newspaper caught my eye. It was tucked beneath a stack of old receipts, its edges yellowed with age. Curious, I pulled it out and unfolded it, my breath catching as I read the headline. Local business tycoon loses everything in fraud scandal. The photo beneath the headline stopped me cold. It was Jack, though younger and cleaner shaven, his suit immaculate and his expression calm despite the chaos the article described. I scanned the text, my heart pounding as the words painted a picture of a man who had once had it all: wealth, power, a family, and lost it in the blink of an eye. The article was sparse on details, but the accusations were clear. Jack had been accused of embezzling funds from his company, a scandal that led to its collapse and left hundreds of employees jobless. There were vague mentions of a court case, though the outcome wasn't specified. What was clear was that Jack had vanished from public life after the scandal, leaving behind a trail of ruined lives and unanswered questions. I sat back on my heels, the newspaper trembling in my hands. This was the man I had invited into my home, the man I had trusted and loved. My mind reeled, trying to recognize the Jack I knew with the one described in the article. Could they be the same person? I couldn't let it go. By the time the sun set, I had read the article a dozen times, my thoughts spinning in circles. Finally, I grabbed my phone and typed out a message to Jack. "We need to talk. Please." The reply came almost instantly. "Where?" I hesitated, then typed, "The park, by the fountain, 1 hour." The park was nearly deserted when I arrived, the fountain casting a faint glow in the evening light. Jack was already there, sitting on a bench with his hands clasped in his lap. He looked up as I approached, his expression guarded but calm. "You found it," he said, his voice steady. I stopped a few feet away, holding the newspaper in my hand. "You knew I would eventually," I replied. Jack nodded, gesturing for me to sit beside him. I hesitated, then lowered myself onto the bench, the paper still clutched tightly in my hands. "I should have told you," he said quietly, his gaze fixed on the fountain, "but I didn't know how." I looked at him, searching his face for answers. "Is it true?" I asked. "Did you do the things they accused you of?" Jack sighed, his shoulders sagging under an invisible weight. "Some of it," he admitted. "Not all, but enough." "We?" I asked, my voice breaking. "Why would you do something like that?" "It's complicated," he said, his tone heavy with regret. "I was trying to protect my family. My company was in trouble, and I made some bad decisions. Decisions I thought I could fix before anyone found out, but it spiraled out of control." I stared at him, the weight of his words sinking in. "And your family?" I asked. "What happened to them?" Jack's jaw tightened, his eyes glistening. "They left," he said simply. "My wife took the kids and moved across the country. I haven't seen them in years." My heart ached at the pain in his voice, but I couldn't shake the sense of betrayal. "Why didn't you tell me any of this?" I asked. "Why let me believe you were just some drifter?" "Because that's who I am now," he said, his voice rough. "I'm not the man I used to be, Lisa. That man is gone." We sat in silence for a long moment, the sound of the fountain filling the space between us. Finally, Jack turned to me, his expression earnest. "I never wanted to lie to you," he said, "but I didn't know how to tell you the truth without losing you." I looked away, my emotions swirling. "And what about me?" I asked. "What am I supposed to do with all of this?" Jack reached for my hand, his touch warm and steady. "You don't owe me anything," he said. "But I care about you, Lisa, more than I ever thought I could care about anyone again." I met his gaze, my heart breaking at the sincerity in his eyes. "I care about you too," I said, my voice trembling, "but I don't know if that's enough." Jack nodded, his hand tightening around mine. "Then figure it out," he said softly. "I'll wait." The days that followed were a blur of confusion and heartache. I avoided Tom as much as possible, retreating to the garden or the guest room to sort through my thoughts. Jack's revelation had shaken me to my core, forcing me to confront truths about myself I'd been avoiding for years. I realized for the first time that my unhappiness wasn't just about Tom or our marriage. It was about me, about the life I'd built around other people's expectations, the dreams I'd abandoned for the sake of appearances. Jack's presence had awakened something in me, a hunger for authenticity I hadn't felt in decades. But the path forward wasn't clear. Could I forgive Jack for his past? Could I forgive myself for the choices I'd made, or the ones I hadn't? One evening, as I sat in the garden, Tom appeared in the doorway. He looked at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "Lisa," he said finally, his voice quiet. "We need to talk." I nodded, setting down the shears I'd been holding. "I know." Tom stepped outside, taking a seat on the bench across from me. "I've been thinking," he said, his tone careful, "about everything, about us." "So have I said, my heart pounding. He hesitated, then looked me in the eye. "Do you want this marriage to work?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. I searched his face, trying to find the answer in my own heart. Finally, I shook my head, tears streaming down my cheeks. I don't know how to anymore, I said, my voice breaking. Tom nodded slowly, his expression a mix of sadness and acceptance. Then maybe it's time we let each other go. The words were like a knife to the chest, but they also brought a strange sense of relief. For the first time in years, I felt the weight of expectation lifting, leaving room for something new. That night, I sat in the guest room, staring at the phone in my hand. My thumb hovered over Jack's number, the decision before me both terrifying and exhilarating. Finally, I took a deep breath and pressed dial. When Jack answered, his voice was warm and steady. "Lisa." "I made my choice," I said, my heart pounding. "I don't know what the future holds, but I know I want to figure it out with you." There was a pause, and then Jack's voice filled with quiet determination. "Then let's figure it out together." The decision to leave my marriage didn't happen overnight. It came in small, deliberate steps, each one harder than the last. Tom and I spent a week navigating the fragile truce that followed our conversation in the garden, both of us walking on eggshells. The house felt like a mausoleum, filled with memories that no longer felt like they belonged to me. Tom wasn't unkind during those days. In fact, he was more present than he'd been in years. But it was too little, too late. His sudden attention felt like an obligation, not a genuine effort to save what we had lost. And I had already moved past the point of return. The hardest part was telling him I was leaving. One quiet evening, as we sat at the dinner table, I folded my hands and took a deep breath. "Tom," I began, my voice steady despite the knot in my stomach. "I think it's time we finalize things." He looked up from his plate, his brow furrowing. "Finalize what?" "Our separation," I said softly. "I've decided to move out." Tom's fork clattered against his plate. "Lisa, we just started talking about this," he said, his voice rising. "Can't we take some time, figure things out?" I shook my head, the resolve I'd been building over the past week solidifying. "I've spent years trying to figure things out, Tom, and I've realized that staying here, in this marriage, isn't what's best for either of us." His face twisted with a mix of anger and desperation. "So that's it? You're just giving up?" "It's not giving up," I said, my voice trembling. "It's choosing something different for both of us." Tom stood abruptly, pushing his chair back with a scrape. He paced the kitchen, his hands clenching and unclenching. "Is it because of him?" he demanded, his eyes blazing. "The man you were seeing while I was away?" I froze, the guilt crashing over me like a wave. "This isn't about Jack," I said carefully, though I knew the words rang hollow. "It's about me, about what I need." "What you need," Tom repeated bitterly, shaking his head. "And what about what I need, Lisa? What about everything I've done to give you a good life?" "A good life isn't just about a roof over my head or money in the bank," I shot back, the frustration spilling out. "It's about connection, about being seen and loved for who I am. And I haven't felt that in years, Tom." He stopped pacing, his chest heaving. "And you think you'll find that with him, a man who... He broke off, his words catching in his throat. "I don't know what I'll find," I admitted, tears streaming down my face. "But I know I won't find it here." Tom stared at me for a long moment, his expression a mix of heartbreak and fury. Then he turned and walked out of the room, leaving me alone with the sound of my own sobs. Packing my things felt surreal, like I was dismantling my life piece by piece. I didn't take much, just clothes, a few personal items, and the photo albums I couldn't bear to leave behind. The rest felt like it belonged to another version of me, one I was ready to leave behind. Tom wasn't home when I left. I had planned it that way, slipping out quietly in the middle of the day while he was at work. As I closed the door behind me, I felt a strange mix of grief and relief. I was stepping into the unknown, but for the first time in years, I felt free. Jack met me at the park, his truck idling near the fountain where we had first spoken about his past. He climbed out as I approached, his expression cautious but hopeful. "You did it," he said, his voice filled with quiet admiration. I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. He stepped closer, his hand brushing mine in a gesture of comfort. "Are you okay?" he asked gently. "Mm, I think so," I said, my voice breaking. "It hurts, but it feels right." Jack nodded, his eyes searching mine. "You're brave, Lisa. Braver than you realize." I leaned into him, the weight of the day pressing against me. He wrapped his arms around me, holding me steady as the tears came. For the first time, I allowed myself to let go, to feel the full weight of everything I had left behind. Over the next few weeks, Jack and I began to carve out a life together. It wasn't perfect. There were moments of doubt, of fear, of wondering if I had made the right choice, but it was real. We rented a small apartment on the outskirts of town, a modest space that felt like a blank slate. Jack found work at a local repair shop, using his skills to build something new for himself. I took a part-time job at a nursery, finding solace in the simplicity of tending to plants. We spent our evenings talking, laughing, and learning about each other in ways we hadn't before. Jack opened up about his past, sharing stories of his children, his wife, and the life he had lost. I shared my own regrets and dreams, the parts of myself I had hidden away for so long. There were challenges, of course. Some days the weight of our choices felt heavier than others. But through it all, Jack remained steadfast, his presence a constant source of strength. One afternoon, as we sat on the porch of our apartment, Jack turned to me with a thoughtful expression. "You've changed," he said, his voice warm. "Ah!" I looked at him, startled. "What do you mean?" He smiled, reaching for my hand. "When I first met you, you seemed lost, like you were carrying the world on your shoulders. But now, there's a lightness to you, like you've found yourself again." I felt a lump rise in my throat, his words hitting me deeply. "I think I have," I said softly. "And I have you to thank for that." Jack shook his head, his smile gentle. "You chose to take the steps. I just walked beside you." I leaned into him, feeling a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. For the first time, I felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be. But life has a way of testing even the strongest foundations. One evening, as Jack and I prepared dinner, there was a knock at the door. I opened it to find Tom standing on the other side, his expression unreadable. "Tom," I said, my voice trembling, "what are you doing here?" He hesitated, his gaze flicking past me to where Jack stood in the kitchen. "I needed to talk to you," he said finally. "It's important." I stepped outside, closing the door behind me. "What is it?" I asked, my heart pounding. Tom looked at me, his expression a mix of sadness and determination. "I know I messed up," he said. "I didn't see you, Lisa. I didn't give you what you needed, and I'm sorry." I stared at him, the sincerity in his voice catching me off guard. "Tom, I want you to come home," he interrupted, his voice breaking. "I'll do whatever it takes to fix things. Just give me another chance." My mind reeled, the weight of his words pressing down on me. I had spent years longing for him to say these things, to fight for me. And now, when I had finally let go, he was here. "I can't," I said finally, my voice trembling. "I've moved on, Tom. I found something real." Tom's face fell, the hope in his eyes fading. He nodded slowly, his shoulders sagging. "I had to try," he said quietly. "I hope you find what you're looking for." As he walked away, I felt a pang of sorrow, but also relief. For the first time, I had chosen my own path, and I knew it was the right one. That night, as Jack and I sat on the couch, I told him about the encounter. He listened quietly, his hand wrapped around mine. "Are you okay?" he asked when I finished. I nodded, a small smile tugging at my lips. "I am. For the first time, I really am." Jack leaned in, pressing a kiss to my forehead. "Then we're going to be just fine," he said softly. And in that moment, I believed him. The 1-year anniversary of the day I met Jack arrived quietly, tucked into the warmth of an unseasonably sunny autumn morning. As I sipped coffee on the balcony of our small apartment, I watched Jack below, his hands steady, as he refinished a battered wooden chair we'd found at a flea market. He worked with a quiet focus that fascinated me, as though each stroke of sandpaper held a purpose beyond the obvious. The chair was symbolic of so much in our lives now, worn and weathered, but worth saving. I realized I'd been staring when Jack looked up, a grin spreading across his face. "You know, you could just take a picture," he teased. I laughed, shaking my head. "And miss the live show? Never." It was moments like these that reminded me how far I'd come. A year ago, I'd been a woman stuck in the monotony of a marriage that had long since faded. Now, I was here, still uncertain of what lay ahead, but sure of the life I was building with Jack. I hadn't just stepped into a new chapter. I'd rewritten the whole book. Later that day, Jack suggested a trip to the coffee shop where we'd first met. I hesitated, unsure if I was ready to face the memories of who I'd been back then, a restless, lonely woman grasping at an impulse she couldn't fully understand. But Jack's steady encouragement nudged me forward. "It's part of the journey," he said, his voice as gentle as the breeze. "And look how far we've come." The coffee shop hadn't changed. The same cozy chairs, the same smell of fresh pastries and coffee beans, the same soft murmur of conversations filled the air. We settled into the corner table by the window where it all began, a subtle déjà vu washing over me. "Do you remember what you thought the first time you saw me?" Jack asked, leaning forward with a playful glint in his eye. I smirked, resting my chin on my hand. "I thought you were trouble." "And now?" he asked, his grin widening. "Now I know you're trouble," I replied, laughing, "but the kind worth every bit of chaos." Jack laughed too, shaking his head. "Fair enough." We sipped our drinks and let the conversation drift. We talked about the life we'd built, the small but meaningful victories, the challenges we'd faced together, the ways we'd learned to navigate the messiness of love and life. Jack listened as I described the joy I'd found at the nursery, my growing confidence in a world I was finally starting to feel like I belonged in. "I've never seen you this happy," he said, his voice tinged with pride. "Because I've never been this happy," I admitted. "Not like this." As the light outside dimmed, Jack reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. My breath hitched as he opened it, revealing a simple silver ring. It wasn't flashy or ornate. It was understated, perfect, and entirely us. "Lisa," he began, his voice steady but soft, "this past year has been the hardest and most beautiful of my life. You gave me hope when I thought there was none left. You made me believe in second chances, not just for myself, but for us. And I want to spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret choosing me." Tears welled in my eyes as he continued, "Will you marry me? Not because we're trying to fix something broken, but because we're building something new." I couldn't speak at first, my heart too full to form words. Finally, I nodded, my voice breaking as I said, "Yes, of course, yes." Jack slipped the ring onto my finger, his hands trembling slightly despite his calm demeanor. The entire room seemed to fade as we leaned toward each other, our foreheads touching, our breaths mingling. It wasn't just a moment. It was a promise. The walk home felt surreal, the weight of the ring on my finger grounding me in the reality of what had just happened. As we reached the steps of our apartment, I stopped, turning to face Jack. "Do you think we'll be okay?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Really okay?" Jack took my hands in his gaze steady and full of warmth. "I don't just think it, I know it," he said. "We've faced more than most people ever will, and we're still here, Lisa. We're still choosing each other." His words settled something deep within me. I leaned into him, letting the steady rhythm of his heartbeat calm my nerves. "I'm ready for whatever comes next," I said softly. Jack smiled, pressing a kiss to my temple. "So am I." That night, as we sat on the couch in our tiny apartment, I looked around at the life we had built. It wasn't perfect. There were still unanswered questions, still moments of doubt, but it was ours. And for the first time, that felt like enough. Jack rested his head against mine, his arm draped around my shoulders. The television hummed in the background, but neither of us paid it any attention. We didn't need words to fill the silence. The quiet was enough. As I glanced down at the ring on my finger, I thought about everything that had led me here, the heartbreak, the choices, the risks. It had been messy and painful and complicated, but it had also been worth it. "I love you," I said, breaking the silence. Jack's smile was soft but sure. "I love you too, Lisa, always." And as the night wrapped around us, I felt something I hadn't in years, a sense of certainty. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew this. I was exactly where I was meant to be.